The black van pulled up to the rusted gates of Philadelphia State Hospital, its headlights barely cutting through the thick mist that clung to the decaying asylum. The old building loomed ahead, crumbling under years of neglect. Legends of its haunted halls and the horrors within were whispered throughout the city, but no one dared come close until now. Agent Cole, the leader of the secret government paranormal team, stepped out of the van, his breath visible in the cold night air. The team, consisting of 5 members, followed closely behind. Among them were tech expert Marlowe, equipment specialist Garcia, medic Daniels, and rookie investigator Harper. Each carried their own fears, but none more than Harper, whose hands trembled as they opened the gate with a loud creak that echoed into the night. "This place gives me the creeps," Harper muttered, eyes darting between the twisted shadows of trees and the building ahead. "Focus," Cole said, his voice cutting through the air. "We've got reports of strange activity, disappearances, people getting attacked by something. This isn't just a haunting. We're dealing with something else." As they stepped inside the courtyard, their equipment flared to life. EMF meters spiked, and the temperature plummeted, a chilling wind sweeping through the cracked walls of the hospital. Garcia set up the infrared cameras, while Marlowe scanned the area with his thermal sensors. "This place isn't just haunted, it's cursed," Daniels whispered. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from within the asylum. The team froze. Harper's flashlight flickered as the shadow of a figure moved across a broken window. "Did you see that?" Harper gasped. "Stay close," Cole ordered, his hand tightening around his sidearm as they entered the hospital. Inside, the air was thick with rot and decay. Old medical charts and rusty gurneys littered the hallways. The team's footsteps echoed in the silence as they ventured deeper into the labyrinth of rooms, every step heavier with the oppressive atmosphere pressing in on them. Then came the whispers, low and unintelligible, like voices from another time. Harper turned wide-eyed as the shadows began to twist. Figures moved in the corner of their vision, phantoms that vanished when looked at directly. Suddenly, the ground shook and the walls vibrated. From the far end of the hall, a door slammed shut with a force that sent a chill down everyone's spine. "Check it out," Cole ordered, pointing towards the door. Garcia nodded, moving forward cautiously. As he approached the door, it flew open on its own, revealing a pitch-black void beyond. His flashlight beam trembled as it cut through the darkness. But what they saw next froze them in place. A figure stood at the far end of the room, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow, its skin pale and stretched. It was neither ghost nor human. It was something else entirely. A crawler. It let out a guttural hiss, its body twisting unnaturally as it darted toward them, faster than they could react. "Run!" Cole shouted. The team bolted down the hallway as the creature chased them, its distorted limbs scraping against the walls. The heavy thuds of its pursuit reverberated through the narrow corridor. Harper's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced back, seeing the crawler's grotesque form moving like a spider through the flickering light. "Go, go!" Cole barked, shoving Marlowe ahead as they rounded a corner. "Get to the control room. We need to find out what we're dealing with." Breathing heavily, they burst into an old staff control room, slamming the door shut behind them. Garcia quickly braced it with a chair, his hands shaking. "Tell me that wasn't real," Harper whispered, his voice cracking with fear. "What the hell was that thing?" "A crawler," Daniels replied, her voice steady but low. "They've been sighted before in abandoned places like this, but I've never seen one up close like that. What are we dealing with?" Marlowe asked, setting up his equipment to monitor the security feeds. Cole took a deep breath. Not just ghosts, but something worse. Skinwalkers, crawlers, maybe even demons. We don't have the full picture yet, but we will soon. Marlowe's screen flickered, showing live footage of the asylum's darkened halls. But something wasn't right. The shapes on the screen moved fast. Blurs of shadow darted across the cameras, too quick to be human. And they weren't alone. Figures roamed the halls, moving with unnatural jerks and spasms. "More of them," Marlowe said, eyes wide. "They're everywhere." Suddenly, the door rattled violently, and the sound of scratching claws scraped against the wood. The crawler was outside, trying to get in. The team backed away, their eyes fixed on the shaking door. "We can't stay here," Cole whispered. "We need to move, or we're dead." But just as they turned to find an exit, the control room's windows shattered. Shards of glass exploded inward, and a cold gust of wind filled the room. Harper screamed as a shadowy figure lunged through the broken window, its eyes glowing red, its body cloaked in a mist of darkness. "A shadowman," Daniels yelled, pulling out her ghost-hunting equipment and firing an EMF pulse. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like static, but it didn't disappear. Instead, it advanced, its long, bony fingers stretching toward them as it glided through the air. "We need to split up," Cole ordered. "It's the only way to survive." The team hesitated, but there was no choice. They couldn't outrun these creatures as a group. With a final glance at each other, they bolted through separate exits, the shadowman following closely behind, its hollow, rasping breath growing louder with every second. But as they ran, they didn't realize they were not the hunters anymore. They were the hunted. The corridors of Philadelphia State Hospital stretched out like an endless maze of crumbling decay. Agent Brooke tightened her grip on the EMF reader as it crackled and hissed, the needle spiking wildly. The stale air seemed to vibrate with invisible tension, as if something unseen was watching their every move. Despite the team's advanced equipment, it felt like they were walking blindfolded through a nightmare. "What the hell is wrong with this place?" muttered Agent Davis, his voice barely above a whisper. Brooke glanced at him, her face pale and drenched in cold sweat. "It's not just the place, it's what's inside it." Suddenly, a faint voice echoed down the hallway, barely audible at first but growing louder. It was the sound of a woman sobbing, her cries low and pitiful, like a lost soul wandering the halls of hell. Brooke and Davis froze, exchanging uneasy glances. "There's no one else here," Davis said, his voice trembling. Brooke nodded slowly. The hospital had been abandoned for decades, but the sound was unmistakable, a tortured cry echoing through the rotting walls. "Stay close," Brooke whispered as they moved toward the source of the sound. Their footsteps echoed hollowly against the cracked tiles, the beam of their flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. As they approached an old, rusted door, the sobbing grew louder, more intense. Brooke hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she reached out and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned, revealing a small, dingy room bathed in shadows. In the center of the room stood a figure, a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her back turned to them. "Ma'am." Brooke's voice was shaky, uncertain. "Are you hurt?" The woman didn't respond. She just continued to sob, her shoulders shaking with each painful cry. Davis raised his flashlight, illuminating her. The light flickered, and in that brief moment, the figure's head snapped around, revealing a face twisted in agony. Her eyes were empty black voids, and her mouth gaped open in a silent scream. Davis stumbled back, swearing under his breath, as Brooke's blood ran cold. Before either of them could react, the woman's body began to twist unnaturally, bones cracking as she contorted and lunged toward them. Her face split into a grotesque smile, her laughter echoing in their heads as if coming from all directions at once. Brooke fired her stun gun, sending an electric jolt through the air. But the entity didn't even flinch. Instead, it began to melt into the shadows, its laughter growing louder and more sinister. Suddenly, the room exploded in chaos. The walls seemed to pulse, dark shapes crawling out from every crevice. Creatures Brooke could barely comprehend. Crawlers with long, spindly limbs and eyes that glowed with a predatory hunger emerged from the shadows, their claws scraping the floor. "Run!" Brooke screamed, grabbing Davis as they bolted from the room, their hearts pounding in terror. But the hospital's walls seemed to shift around them, trapping them in an endless loop of darkened corridors. The sobbing continued to echo, growing louder, more maddening. As they ran, Brooke realized with growing horror that the hospital was alive. It was feeding on their fear, twisting their reality. The creatures weren't just hunting them, they were toying with them. They burst into what had once been a patient ward, the door slamming shut behind them. Brooke's chest heaved as she gasped for breath, her eyes darting around the room. Rows of rusted hospital beds stood empty, their metal frames groaning in the oppressive silence. But something was wrong. There were dark stains on the walls, smeared in jagged, chaotic patterns. "Is that blood?" Davis asked, his voice hoarse. Brooke stepped closer, her flashlight flickering as it illuminated the walls. The stains weren't just blood, they were symbols. Horrid, twisted markings that seemed to pulsate as if alive, written in thick, congealed layers of dried blood. As they examined the grotesque murals, the lights suddenly blinked out, plunging the room into total darkness. Davis cursed, fumbling for his flashlight. Brooke's heart raced as she felt the temperature drop rapidly, her breath visible in the frigid air. Suddenly, a deep, rumbling growl filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards. Brooke raised her flashlight, trembling, and froze. Standing at the far end of the room was a figure, hulking monstrous, its body a mass of shadow and sinew. Its eyes glowed red, and its mouth curled into a snarl, revealing jagged, rotting teeth. Before she could move, the creature charged, its massive form barreling toward them with terrifying speed. Davis fired his weapon, but the bullets passed through it like smoke. The creature slammed into him, sending him crashing into the wall. Brooke screamed as Davis's body was lifted off the ground and violently thrown across the room, blood splattering the walls as his head cracked against the floor. The creature turned its attention to Brooke, its glowing eyes narrowing as it stalked toward her. She backed away, her heart pounding in her throat, until she was pressed against the cold, blood-stained wall. Desperately, she fumbled for the EMF reader in her pocket, its needle spiking wildly as the creature drew closer. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and just as the creature lunged, the EMF reader emitted a piercing shriek. The creature recoiled, its form flickering violently, before dissolving into a cloud of black smoke. The growling faded, leaving Brooke alone in the blood-soaked room, her body shaking uncontrollably. But the relief was short-lived. The walls began to bleed again, fresh rivulets of crimson oozing down the decaying plaster. The symbols began to pulse, glowing faintly in the darkness, as if summoning something far worse than what had just left. Brooke had to get out, but she had no idea how, or if she'd make it out alive. Brooke and Davis stood at the base of a narrow, decaying staircase that spiraled upward into the darkness of the hospital's long-abandoned attic. The air grew colder the higher they climbed, each step accompanied by the groaning creak of old wood beneath their feet. The faint stench of decay clung to their nostrils, and the feeling that something was lurking above them grew more suffocating with each passing second. "We need to check the attic," Davis whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows warily. "The EMF's off the charts. Whatever's up there, it's big." Brooke nodded, her hand shaking slightly as she tightened her grip on the flashlight. She didn't need to look at the EMF reader to feel the unnatural energy pulsing through the hospital. Something ancient and malevolent had awakened. The moment they reached the top of the stairs, the air changed. It became thick and heavy, filled with the sound of faint whispers, like voices calling from just out of sight. Davis paused, glancing around nervously. "Did you hear that?" Brooke opened her mouth to respond when a blood-curdling scream erupted from the darkness above them. It was loud, shrill, and inhuman, the kind of sound that made your bones ache and your mind splinter. Without thinking, Brooke aimed her flashlight at the ceiling, illuminating an old trapdoor covered in rotting wood. The screaming continued, echoing through the walls, but there was no one there. "Stay close," Brooke muttered, trying to keep her voice steady as she reached for the trapdoor. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pushed it open with a rusty groan. Above them was a black abyss, filled with shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Climbing through the hatch, they entered the attic. Dust floated in thick clouds, and the air was stiflingly hot. The beams of their flashlights barely penetrated the suffocating gloom. As they walked deeper into the attic, the floorboards creaked ominously beneath their feet, threatening to give way at any moment. Suddenly, Davis froze. "Brooke, look." Brooke swung her flashlight to where Davis was pointing. Hanging from the rafters was a series of crude dolls, fashioned from decaying straw and old rags. Their heads were made of animal skulls, eyes hollow and staring, their mouths twisted into grotesque grins. The dolls swayed ever so slightly, though there was no breeze. Beneath them, symbols had been etched into the floor, written in blood that looked alarmingly fresh. "This is some kind of ritual site," Brooke whispered, while rising in her throat. A summoning. The screaming suddenly stopped. In the dead silence that followed, a low growl rumbled through the attic, vibrating through their bones. Brooke's flashlight flickered and then died, plunging them into complete darkness. Davis cursed as he fumbled with his flashlight, but Brooke's heart stopped when she felt something cold brush against her neck. She whipped around, her breath catching in her throat, but nothing was there. The growl came again, louder now, closer. Then, out of the shadows, something slithered. It was long, pale, and disturbingly human-like, but its limbs were wrong, too thin, bending at unnatural angles. Its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light as it crawled toward them on all fours, its mouth filled with sharp, rotting teeth. "Run!" Davis shouted, pulling Brooke back just as the creature lunged at them. They sprinted toward the stairs, the thing's wet breathing and guttural growls echoing behind them. Brooke glanced back for a second, and her blood ran cold. The creature was crawling along the ceiling, its limbs bending and snapping as it moved impossibly fast, its eyes locked on them. The trapdoor came into view, but as they reached it, the attic shook violently, and the floor beneath them cracked open. Brooke's stomach lurched as the ground gave way beneath her feet. She fell, tumbling into darkness, her body slamming into the cold, wet floor below. The wind was knocked out of her lungs, and pain shot through her arm. Gasping for breath, she scrambled to her feet, only to find herself in a vast underground chamber, dimly lit by a faint, eerie red glow. Davis landed beside her with a thud, groaning in pain. "Where are we?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. Brooke raised her flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The chamber was enormous, its walls covered in thick roots and vines, which seemed to pulse like veins. The floor was slick with something wet and dark blood. There were bodies strewn about, some fresh, others decomposing, all twisted in unnatural positions. "We need to get out of here," Brooke said, her voice trembling. But before they could take another step, a low, sinister voice echoed through the chamber. "You're too late." Brooke spun around, heart racing, to see a figure standing at the far end of the chamber. It was dressed in tattered black robes, its face hidden beneath a hood, but its eyes, those eyes, glowed a deep, malevolent red. The figure raised a hand, and the walls of the chamber began to move. Dark shapes peeled away from the stone, crawling down like living shadows. Crawlers, dozens of them, their bodies twisted and contorted as they moved, eyes gleaming with a hunger that chilled Brooke to the bone. The robed figure smiled, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You've entered my domain, and now you will join them." Brooke backed away, her mind racing for a plan. But as the crawlers closed in, Davis raised his gun and fired. The bullets tore through the creatures, but they kept coming undeterred, their movements growing more frenzied. "We're trapped," Davis growled, firing another round. Brooke knew he was right. The chamber was sealing them in, the walls closing around them, the crawlers swarming like rabid animals. Just when all hope seemed lost, the ground beneath them trembled violently. The roots hanging from the ceiling began to writhe like snakes, tearing through the earth and wrapping around the crawlers, dragging them into the blood-soaked ground. The robed figure let out a guttural scream, raising both arms as the chamber shuddered. Brooke and Davis were thrown to the ground as the air crackled with energy. A dark portal began to form in the center of the room, swirling with shadow and blood. Brooke's eyes widened. "We need to stop that thing now." The group's frantic sprint through the endless corridors led them deeper into the heart of the Philadelphia State Hospital. The once sterile, clinical walls had turned into a grotesque gallery of decaying memories. Flickering lights barely illuminated the dried bloodstains smeared across the cracked tiles. Harper, now separated from the others, was hyperventilating as he moved cautiously through the darkness. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. His earpiece crackled to life. "Harper, where are you?" Cole's voice cut through the static, though his tone was shaky. I'm near the eastern wing," Harper whispered, clutching his equipment as though it would shield him from the horrors lurking in the dark. "I can hear something moving." "We're not alone here," Cole responded, his voice barely audible. "Marlowe spotted movement, more crawlers, but they're not alone. Be careful." Just then, A low growl echoed from the shadows behind Harper. His blood ran cold. He whipped around, shining his light down the hallway, but nothing was there. His breath quickened as the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't imagining it. Something was stalking him. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, sprinting at him with unnatural speed. It wasn't a crawler, it was worse. A skinwalker, its grotesque face twisted in a mockery of a human smile, with skin stretched tight over its monstrous skull. Harper screamed and bolted down the corridor as the creature gained on him, its clawed hands scraping the walls as it pursued. "Cole! Cole, help me!" Harper's voice cracked as he ran for his life, sweat pouring down his face. His lungs burned, but the skinwalker was relentless, its heavy footsteps echoing in his ears. He turned a corner, nearly slipping on the slick floor, and barreled into an empty room. There was no escape. Harper's heart pounded as he pressed himself against the wall, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hands. The skinwalker stopped in the doorway, its misshapen form silhouetted by the flickering lights. It tilted its head, as though savoring his terror, before stepping inside with deliberate slowness. Harper's back hit the wall. He was trapped. In a desperate move, Harper raised his EMF reader and fired a pulse of energy toward the creature. The skinwalker screeched in agony, its form shimmering and glitching like a bad TV signal. But the attack only slowed it down. Harper knew it wouldn't stop until he was dead. Suddenly, gunfire erupted. Bullets sprayed through the room as Cole and Garcia stormed in, guns blazing. The skinwalker shrieked, staggering back as rounds tore through its distorted body. "Harper, move!" Cole shouted, pulling him away from the wall. As they made their escape, Harper glanced back just in time to see the creature's twisted form collapse, writhing on the floor before finally disintegrating into a mist of dark smoke. But before he could breathe a sigh of relief, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the building. It was Daniel's. The scream had frozen them in place. Harper, Cole, and Garcia exchanged horrified glances. They had no time to process the terror they had just survived. Daniels was in danger, and something far worse was hunting them. "We have to find her," Cole said, his voice hard but laced with urgency. He gestured for the team to move, and they tore down the hallway, the distant echoes of Daniel's screams guiding them deeper into the hospital's decaying core. As they sprinted, Garcia scanned their surroundings with his thermal sensors. "I'm picking up heat signatures all around us," he muttered. "They're everywhere." The team slowed as they reached the entrance to the psychiatric ward, a place infamous for its cruel experiments on the patients who had once lived here. The air was thick with dread, and the faint sound of disembodied voices filled the hall, growing louder with every step they took. It was as though the walls themselves were whispering, feeding off their fear. "Daniels!" Cole called out, his voice bouncing off the empty corridors. But there was no response, only silence. Suddenly, Harper's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into almost total darkness. Panic gripped him as he fumbled with his equipment. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We're sitting ducks." Before Cole could respond, the door at the end of the corridor creaked open. A cold draft swept through, carrying with it the stench of death. From the shadows emerged a figure, a man, or at least something that used to be a man. His eyes were hollow, his skin as pale as the dead, and he dragged a rusted chain behind him. Who are you?" Garcia asked, backing away as the figure moved closer, his footsteps echoing through the empty hall. "Lost souls," the figure rasped, his voice a guttural whisper. "We all are, and soon you will be too." Without warning, the door behind them slammed shut with a force that shook the building. The team spun around, only to find themselves surrounded by shadowy figures, their glowing eyes fixated on the intruders. "Move," Cole ordered, but it was too late. The figures lunged, their forms flickering in and out of reality. Harper swung his flashlight wildly, trying to fend them off, but they passed through the light, unaffected. Garcia fired his gun, but the bullets passed through the shadowmen like smoke. The team was being herded, forced into the center of the room, where a dark pit gaped open in the floor. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural energy, pulling them toward its abyss. "We have to find Daniels," Harper shouted. But even as he said it, he knew they were out of time. From the pit, a deep, guttural growl emerged, and something began to rise. A creature unlike anything they had seen before. It was enormous, its body covered in scales and twisted flesh, with glowing red eyes that locked onto them. Cole grabbed Harper's arm, pulling him back. "We can't fight this. We need to get out now." But the shadows had closed in, and the pit was opening wider, threatening to swallow them whole. The demonic presence that rose from it let out a deafening roar, and the last thing Harper saw before everything went black was the glowing eyes of the shadowmen, watching them as they fell into the abyss. The darkness inside the hospital had grown alive, pressing in on the remaining members of the team with a weight that felt suffocating. Brooke and Davis had been separated from the others during the chaos of the last attack, and now they found themselves trapped in one of the deeper, forgotten wings of Philadelphia State Hospital. The walls seemed to breathe. Soft whispers skittered across the cracked plaster, growing louder as the two advanced down the narrow corridor. Their flashlights flickered erratically, as if struggling against the malevolent force that had taken hold of the place. Davis glanced at Brooke, his face pale but determined. "We need to find the others," he muttered, gripping his gun tightly. "If they're still." A piercing scream cut through the air, silencing Davis mid-sentence. It was a blood-curdling wail, echoing from somewhere far down the hall, too human to be an animal, too twisted to be anything alive. Brooke's stomach knotted. "We're not alone," she whispered. Suddenly, the walls began to vibrate, the whispers growing into frantic murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. Brooke took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding in her chest, but as soon as her foot touched the floor, the lights died. Complete darkness enveloped them, the whispers now almost deafening. "Stay close," Davis hissed, his voice tight with fear. The sound of something wet and heavy dragged across the floor behind them. Brooke whipped her flashlight around, but nothing appeared in the beam. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and the oppressive weight of the hospital's ancient evil settled over them like a blanket. A sudden gust of wind slammed into them, nearly knocking them off their feet. Brooke stumbled, clutching the wall for balance, and when she looked up, her blood ran cold. Figures, shadowy, elongated, were crawling out of the cracks in the walls, their bodies twisted unnaturally, limbs bending in grotesque angles as they pulled themselves toward Brooke and Davis. Their eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and their mouths hung open, filled with rows of jagged, blackened teeth. "Run!" Davis screamed, pulling Brooke with him as they bolted down the hallway. The shadows chased them, their whispering growing louder and more frantic, as if they were chanting some ancient curse. They turned a corner, only to come face to face with the robed figure they had encountered earlier. It stood in the center of the hallway, its eyes burning red, the same malicious grin stretching across its face. "You've seen too much," it hissed, raising a hand toward them. Before Brooke could react, the walls of the hospital began to close in, warping and bending as if the building itself was alive, working in tandem with the creature. The floor buckled beneath their feet, sending both of them crashing to the ground. Out of nowhere, something latched onto Davis's leg, yanking him backward into the shadows. He screamed, firing wildly into the dark, but his bullets had no effect. "Brooke!" he shouted, his voice filled with desperation as he was dragged into the writhing mass of shadow creatures. Brooke scrambled to her feet, panic surging through her veins. She fired her own weapon into the mass, but the creatures just kept coming, their soulless eyes fixed on her now. She was alone. Brooke's legs ached as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The walls had closed in behind her, sealing off the corridors of the hospital, leaving her with one option: the Red Room. It had been whispered about for years, a sealed-off wing of the hospital where the most disturbed patients had been held during its peak. Now it was the epicenter of the malevolent force. She burst through the rusted door, her flashlight shaking in her hand as she entered. The room was bathed in a deep, throbbing crimson light, emanating from an old altar at its center. Blood smeared the walls, and the air was thick with the stench of rot and decay. The room was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint sound of dripping liquid. Brooke approached the altar, her heart hammering in her chest. A single figure lay sprawled across it. Davis, his eyes wide open but unseeing, blood trickling from his mouth. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the grim truth. The ritual had begun. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and Brooke could feel a presence behind her. Slowly, she turned, her skin crawling with dread. The robed figure stood in the corner, its hands raised in triumph. "You are the final piece," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "With your blood, the veil will be torn." Brooke tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. The room had become alive, its walls writhing like serpents, closing in on her. Blood oozed from the ceiling, dripping onto her skin as a thick, oily darkness slithered toward her. From the shadows, the creatures emerged once more, crawling along the walls and ceiling, their mouths wide open in a silent scream. They surrounded her, cutting off any escape. Brooke raised her weapon one last time, her hands trembling. She fired, but the bullets passed through the creatures like smoke. There was no escape. The room was closing in, the creatures pressing closer, their claws reaching for her flesh. Just as the darkness engulfed her, a blinding light exploded from the altar. The creatures recoiled, hissing and shrieking in pain. The walls trembled, and the robed figure screamed, its body contorting in agony. Brooke felt herself being pulled backward, yanked out of the room by a force she couldn't see. She tumbled through the hospital's crumbling halls, the screams of the creatures echoing behind her. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the robed figure's face, twisted in rage and fear as it was consumed by the light. And then everything went dark.